Vesna hadn't expected her sons to shift for the first time on an ordinary morning at the Thornfeld market. But here she was, standing between a cart of late autumn pears and a wooden stall selling candle wax, watching two impossibly small wolves tear across the cobblestones while the entire market went silent around her. Her boys were 5 years old. Wolf children didn't shift before 12. It was as fixed a truth as the sun rising in the east. Even the strongest alpha bloodlines produced first shifts around 13 or 14. 15 was common. 16 was unremarkable. 5 was impossible. And yet, Caius hit the ground first, his small body twisted mid-stride, bone and sinew rearranging with a speed that made Vesna's stomach lurch. One moment he was a dark-haired boy in a patched wool coat, chasing his brother past the bread stall. The next, he was a wolf, silver-furred, far too large for a pup, with eyes that burned an unnatural amber gold. Stellan followed half a breath later. His shift was even faster, his wolf a mirror of his brother's, except for a streak of black running across his chest like a blade, marked through snow. The merchant closest to them stumbled backward into his own stall, sending a tower of clay pots crashing to the cobblestones. A woman screamed. Someone snatched their child off the ground and ran. A basket of dried fish hit the stones and scattered. Vesna couldn't move, not because of shock. She'd suspected this was coming. The signs had been building for months. Caius, growling low in his sleep, his fingers curling like claws against the sheets. Stellan running fevers that broke within minutes, his skin burning hot one moment and cool the next. Both of them, hearing things no child their age should be able to hear, smelling storms before the clouds formed, tracking rabbits through the winter woods by scent alone. She couldn't move, because of what she saw standing at the far end of the market square. 3 riders, armored, bearing the gray and silver crest of the Valdrin throne, kingdom's soldiers, here, in a village, so far from the capital that most maps didn't bother to name it. The lead rider had already dismounted. He was a tall man with heavy shoulders, and the kind of face that had witnessed too many things to be surprised by any of them, but he was surprised now. Vesna watched the color drain from his expression, as his gaze locked onto the 2 silver wolves, circling each other in the middle of the square, silver fur, amber gold eyes. That particular shade of silver that hadn't appeared in the Valdrin bloodline for 3 generations. Until now, the soldier's hand dropped to his sword hilt. Not in aggression, in reflex. The instinct of a man confronting something he'd been trained to lay down his life protecting. Royal blood wolves, the other 2 riders exchanged a glance behind him. One of them reached slowly for the horn at his belt, the signal horn. The one that would carry a message to the nearest outpost, and from there to the next, and from there to the next until the sound reached Greymark itself, until the sound reached the king. Vesna's body unlocked. She moved without thinking, cutting through the frozen crowd with her healer's bag banging against her hip. She reached her sons and dropped to her knees, wrapping one arm around each wolf and pulling them against her chest. They were warm. Trembling, their small hearts hammered against her palms like trapped birds. Caius whined softly and pressed his muzzle into her neck. Stellan bared his teeth at the soldiers, a low growl vibrating through his entire body, and Vesna pressed her hand firmly against his flank. "Shift back," she whispered into the fur between their ears. "Both of you, right now." They did. Slowly, clumsily. 2 small boys in torn clothes, shivering and wide-eyed, blinking up at her with golden irises that hadn't yet faded back to brown. The lead soldier took a step forward. "Don't." Vesna's voice came out sharper than she intended, edged with half a decade of buried fear and a mother's iron will. The soldier stopped. "My name is Fennec," he said carefully, "commander of the Northern Border Guard. I mean you and your children no harm." Vesna held his gaze and said nothing. Her arms tightened around her sons. Fennec's eyes moved from the boys to her face, and she watched him put it together. The silver wolves. The jaw and cheekbone structure that was on these two small faces, an unmistakable echo of the man who sat on the Valdrin throne. "You're her," Fennec said, barely above a whisper. "The former Luna." Vesna stood, pulling her boys behind her legs. "You are mistaken," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were useless. She'd seen his face. She'd seen the recognition settle into his features, the impossible arithmetic resolving behind his eyes, a barren Luna who vanished in the night half a decade ago. Two silver-blooded wolf pups who shouldn't exist. A village at the far edge of the kingdom where no one ever thought to look. Until now, Mama. Caius tugged at her sleeve, his small fingers still trembling from the shift. "Who are those men?" Vesna didn't answer. She was already calculating. The cottage was a 10-minute walk from the square. She could pack what mattered in 5. They could be on the North Road before sunset, across the river by morning, gone before anyone from Greymark could respond to a signal horn's call. But even as the plan formed, she felt the weight of the truth she'd been carrying since the night she fled settle onto her shoulders like a stone. You cannot outrun a kingdom forever. Behind her, the second soldier raised the horn to his lips. The sound it made was low and mournful, rolling across the valley like distant thunder. It would reach the next outpost within the hour. By nightfall, the king would know. Vesna didn't run. She wanted to. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to grab her boys and disappear into the northern woods the way she'd done all those years ago. Barefoot and pregnant, and so terrified she could taste copper on her tongue. She'd done it once. She could do it again. But Caius was clinging to her hand, and Stellan had pressed himself against her leg. And both of them were shaking from their first shift. Their skin was fever-hot. Their eyes still flickered between brown and gold like a candle guttering in a draught. They needed warmth. They needed rest. They needed Brindis. She led them through the back lanes of Thornfeld, avoiding the market square, where Fennec and his soldiers still stood like statues beside their horses. The village was small enough that news traveled faster than footsteps, and she could already see curtains twitching, doors cracking open, faces peering out with expressions caught between curiosity and fear. She had lived here since before the boys were born, all that time spent grinding herbs and stitching wounds, and pretending she was nobody, a widow. A drifter who'd washed up on Thornfeld's doorstep, with a swollen belly and no past worth mentioning. The village had accepted her because Brindis had vouched for her, and because Vesna had made herself useful. She'd become the second healer, the one who showed up in the middle of the night when a child had a cough that wouldn't break, the one who never asked for much, and never said anything about where she'd come from. That woman was gone now, shattered like the clay pots in the market square, and what stood in her place was the thing she'd spent all this time trying to bury. The former Luna of Valdrin, cast aside, declared Barren, replaced. Brindis was already standing in the doorway of the cottage when Vesna rounded the corner, her arms folded across her chest and her gray hair pulled back in the severe knot she wore when she was worried and trying not to show it. The old healer's gaze swept over the boys and something in her expression tightened. "Inside," Brindis said. Now, the cottage smelled of dried rosemary and wood smoke. Vesna settled the boys onto the low bench near the hearth and wrapped them in a wool blanket. Caius had stopped shaking, but Stellan's teeth were still chattering, and his eyes wouldn't stop flickering. "His wolf is fighting to come back out," Brindis observed, kneeling beside the boy and pressing her palm against his forehead. "That's not unusual after a first shift. What's unusual is that he shifted at all." She looked up at Vesna. 5 years old. "I know. Twin alphas, Vesna. Do you understand what that means?" Vesna closed her eyes. Yes, she understood. Twin alpha births hadn't been recorded in the kingdom for over 200 years. They were the stuff of old songs and older prophecies. The last pair had united the 3 fractured wolf territories into a single kingdom during the Ashfall War. Before that, twin alphas had ended a famine by leading their pack to the Greenvale. Every recorded instance of twin alpha births in Valdrin history coincided with a turning point, a transformation. Her sons weren't just rare. They were the kind of rare that drew the attention of thrones. The soldiers saw, Vesna said, her voice hollow. A border patrol. They were in the market when it happened. Brindis was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Stellan's breathing began to even out as the old healer's hands moved with practiced steadiness, pressing warmth into his temples. "How long do we have?" Brindis asked. They sounded the horn. "By tonight, the nearest garrison will know. By tomorrow the message reaches the capital," Vesna swallowed hard. 2 days, maybe 3, before riders arrive, from Greymark. And by riders, you mean the king. Vesna flinched. The word hit her like a physical blow, and she hated herself for it. Hated that after all this time, the mention of him could still make something beneath her ribs twist with a pain that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a wound that had never properly healed. Tavern. She hadn't spoken his name out loud in years, hadn't let herself think about the way his voice had sounded when he'd said the words that ended her life as she knew it. The council has decided. The bloodline must continue. No choice, as though she were a broken tool being swapped out for one that worked, as though 3 years of standing beside him, loving him, building a life with him could be reduced to the single function she'd failed to perform. She'd begged him. That was the part that still burned worst, the memory she couldn't smother, no matter how many years she piled on top of it. She'd stood in their chambers, in the room that smelled like his cedar and her lavender, and she'd begged him to fight for her. He hadn't. He'd stood with his back to her and said nothing, while the council's guards escorted her from the palace. She'd walked out through the great hall in front of 200 courtiers, who watched her leave, like she was a stain being wiped from polished stone. That was the night she discovered she was pregnant. Alone in a way station at the edge of the northern road, vomiting into a ditch, dizzy with grief. The irony had been so savage it made her laugh until she cried, "Barren." They'd called her Barren. And she'd believed them, because why would anyone lie about something like that, Mama? Caius was watching her from the bench, his dark eyes clear now, the gold fully receded. He looked so much like his father that some mornings it stole her breath. "Are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart. Because of what we did with the wolves." Vesna knelt in front of him and took both his hands. His fingers were small and warm, and still slightly trembling. "You are not in trouble," she said firmly. "You did nothing wrong." Caius studied her face with the unsettling perceptiveness he'd inherited from a man he'd never met. "Then, why are you scared?" Before she could answer, a knock sounded at the cottage door. Not loud, not aggressive, patient and deliberate, which was somehow worse. Brindis opened it. Fennec stood on the step, his helmet under his arm, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm not here to take anyone," he said, holding up one hand when Vesna moved instinctively toward her boys. "I've ordered my men to stand down. But I need to tell you something, and I'd rather you hear it from me, before the crown sends someone less inclined to knock first." Vesna's jaw tightened. "Say it, then." Fennec hesitated. His gaze moved past her to where Caius and Stellan sat on the bench, wrapped in their blanket, watching him with wide, serious eyes. "The kingdom is fracturing," he said, keeping his voice low. "The northern packs have broken treaty. The eastern border has fallen twice this year. The capital's reserves are nearly spent. And the king," he paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "The king has no heir. The new Luna left court 3 years ago. There is no successor, no bloodline to hold the packs together." The quiet that followed was suffocating. "That is not my problem," Vesna said, though something cold had begun to coil in the pit of her stomach. Fennec met her eyes. "Those 2 boys are the only living heirs to the Valdrin throne. They won't just send riders. They will send the beta himself." He paused. "Once that horn signal reaches the capital, there won't be a force in the kingdom that can stop what comes next." Hadric arrived on the third morning, exactly as Fennec had predicted. Vesna saw him from the cottage window. A single rider on a black horse, moving through the pale autumn mist with the unhurried precision of someone who knew the world would wait for him. No soldiers flanked him, no banners, no horn blasts or fanfare. Just one man, in a dark traveling cloak, dismounting in the village square like he'd come to buy flour. She recognized him instantly. The king's beta had barely changed, the same lean, angular face. The same way of holding himself that made him look like a drawn blade standing upright. His dark hair was shorter than she remembered, and there were new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when she'd last seen him. But the rest of him was exactly as she'd known him. Hadric had been the one to tell her, in those final hours at Greymark, that the king's decision was final. He'd stood in the corridor outside the chambers she'd shared with Chavrin, and delivered the council's verdict with a composure so complete she'd wanted to hit him. He hadn't been cruel. He hadn't been kind. He'd been efficient, and somehow that had been the worst of all. Vesna pulled back from the window and turned to Brindis. "Watch the boys," she said. "You're going out there. If I make him come to us, the whole village will see." "I would rather do this somewhere with fewer eyes." Brindis gave her a hard look, but nodded. "Be careful." Vesna stepped outside into the cold morning air. The mist sat heavy across Thornfeld, muffling sounds and softening the edges of the world. She met him at the low stone wall that marked the boundary of Brindis's garden, and for a long moment they simply stood there, studying each other across the gap of the vanished years. "Luna Vesna," Hadric said. "Don't call me that," Vesna replied. "I haven't been Luna for a long time." Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, exactly. Hadric didn't deal in guilt. But something adjacent to it, something that looked like the acknowledgement of a debt he hadn't expected to still carry. "You look well," he offered. "You didn't ride 3 days to tell me I look well." The corner of his mouth twitched. "No, I did not." Silence. The mist curled between them. Somewhere in the village, a rooster crowed. "I need to see the boys," Hadric said. "No, Vesna, you don't get to say my name like that." Her voice was steady, but her hands were clenched at her sides, hard enough that her nails bit into her palms. "You don't get to ride into my life and act like you've come to check on family. You came to verify a report. So let me save you the trouble." She lifted her chin. "They're his. They're both alphas. And they shifted 3 days ago, at the age of 5, which I'm sure is the part that actually brought you here." Hadric absorbed this without visible reaction. "Both alphas," he repeated. "Both." Another pause. This one lasted longer. "Twin alpha births haven't occurred in Valdrin since the Ashfall unification," Hadric said, his voice measured and careful in the way she remembered from council meetings, the voice he used when something enormous was being said quietly. "There are records. Prophecies. I'm aware. The bloodline confirmation will need to be formal. There's nothing to confirm. Look at them. They have his jaw. They have his eyes." Hadric shook his head slowly. "The council won't accept resemblance. There's a rite. The hearthblood confirmation. A drop of blood on the ancestral stone, and if the lineage is true, the stone responds." Vesna's gut tightened. She'd watched it performed once at court, for a lesser noble's disputed heir. The stone had glowed pale amber, confirming the bloodline. It was old magic, ancient, predating the kingdom itself, and it couldn't be faked. "That stone is in Greymark," Vesna said flatly. "Which means you're asking me to bring my sons to the capital." "Yes, to the palace where I was stripped of my title and escorted out like a criminal." Hadric didn't flinch, but his gaze dropped for the first time. "Yes, where the man who chose the council's word over mine sits on the throne. Yes, and you think I would do this willingly?" The quiet that followed felt like it had teeth. Hadric clasped his hands behind his back, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard in it before, something closer to exhaustion than authority. "I think you will hear what I have to say, and then you will make whatever decision you believe is right. That is all I have ever known you to do." Vesna crossed her arms. The mist was thinning. Soon, the village would stir fully, and curious faces would appear at windows, and this conversation would become public knowledge. "Talk then," she said. Hadrick looked at the garden wall, at the cottage behind her, at the distant line of bare trees marking the edge of the northern woods. He looked everywhere except at her, and the evasion was so unlike him that it unsettled her more than his arrival had. "The kingdom is dying," he said. "Not metaphorically, the land itself. The harvests have failed for 2 consecutive years. The rivers in the eastern province are running lower each season. The wolves in the outer packs are getting sick. A wasting illness that none of the healers can explain, and their wolves are growing weaker." He paused. "Including the king's." Vesna's breath caught before she could stop it. "The old texts call it a severed hearthline," Hadrick continued. "When the bond between the ruling bloodline and the land is broken or incomplete, the kingdom suffers. It starts, slowly, crop failures, animal sickness, then it accelerates." "And you believe the hearthline is severed," Vesna said, her voice carefully controlled. "I believe the throne has no heir. The bond between king and kingdom requires continuity, a bloodline promise that the land will be tended, generation after generation. When that promise is broken," he trailed off. "The land breaks with it," Vesna finished. Hadrick met her eyes, and what she saw there made the ground feel unsteady beneath her feet. Because the king's beta, the man who never showed weakness, who delivered death sentences with the same tone he used to order breakfast, looked afraid. "How long?" Vesna asked. "How long does the kingdom have?" "The healers estimate perhaps a year, possibly less." Hadrick's jaw worked beneath the skin. "The king is aware. He's been searching for a solution. Any solution, except the obvious one." Hadrick said nothing. "He's been searching for a solution," Vesna repeated slowly, "while his 2 sons have been living a 3-day ride from the capital, which tells me he didn't know they existed." She studied Hadrick's face. "Or did he?" The beta's silence answered for him. Vesna felt something hot and sharp twist behind her ribs. Not surprise. She was long past being surprised by the ways that Pallas had failed her. But something deeper. Something that felt like the last thread of an old hope quietly snapping. "He didn't look for me," she said. "It wasn't a question," Hadrick answered. "Anyway, he believed you would build a better life without him," the beta murmured. "He believed letting you go was the kindest thing he could do." Vesna laughed. The sound came out brittle and hollow, and nothing like amusement. "Of course he did. The king always did prefer noble suffering to an honest conversation." She turned toward the cottage, then stopped. "If I bring my sons to Greymark," she said without looking back, "it will be on my terms. They will not be taken from me. They will not be paraded before the council. And I will not stand in that hall and be examined like a mare brought back to the stable." Her voice hardened. "Those are the conditions. All of them." "Agreed," Hadrick said immediately. Too immediately. Like he'd been authorized to accept whatever she demanded. Which meant the king was desperate. Good. Vesna pushed open the cottage door and stepped inside. Caius and Stellan looked up from the hearth where Brindis had been teaching them to sort dried herbs. Their hands were stained green. Their eyes were wide and curious and painfully innocent. "Boys," Vesna said, kneeling in front of them. "We're going on a trip." "Where?" Stellan asked. Vesna took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. "To meet your father." The road to Greymark took 2.5 days. Vesna spent most of it in silence, watching the landscape change through the window of the carriage Hadrick had arranged. The northern wilderness gave way to farmland, and the farmland gave way to something worse. Fields that should have been heavy with late harvest sat brown and barren. Orchards stood skeletal against the pale sky, their branches bare, weeks too early. A river they crossed on the second afternoon was so low that the stones of its bed lay exposed and dry, like the spine of a dying animal. Hadrick had not been exaggerating. The land was sick. Caius pressed his face against the carriage window and frowned. Mama, why is everything so sad here? Vesna's chest tightened. What do you mean? Sad. The ground feels sad. Can you not feel it? But Stellan nodded like his brother had said the most obvious thing in the world, and the two of them sat with their palms flat against the wooden seat for the rest of the journey, their small faces creased with concentration, as though they were listening to something beneath the road that only they could hear. Grimark appeared on the third morning. The capital city of Valdren rose from the valley floor in tiers of gray stone and dark timber, its highest point crowned by the palace, the same palace where she'd spent 3 years as Luna. The same palace she'd walked out of with nothing. The carriage passed through the main gates without stopping. Hadric had arranged a private entrance, a side corridor used by servants and tradespeople, but word had already spread. By the time Vesna stepped out of the carriage with a boy gripping each hand, a crowd of courtiers had gathered along the upper gallery, staring down at her with expressions that ranged from shock to open hostility. She kept her eyes forward and her back straight, and walked through it. The Hearthblood chamber was deep inside the palace. Vesna had never been inside it. During her time as Luna, the chamber had been sealed, reserved for succession rights and bloodline disputes. The door was old ironwood, carved with wolf sigils so ancient the edges had softened into abstraction. Inside, the room was circular and windowless. A single stone stood at its center, waist-high, black and smooth, with veins of pale silver running through it like frozen lightning. Torches lined the walls, their flames steady and windless. An elderly woman stood beside the stone. Vesna didn't recognize her, but Hadric inclined his head with a deference she'd rarely seen from him. "Elder Salven," Hadric said. "The heirs are here." Salvain's gaze moved from the boys to Vesna and stayed there for a long measuring moment. She was tall and thin with white hair braided close to her skull and eyes, so pale they were almost colorless. She moved like someone who had stopped rushing decades ago, and found no reason to start again. "Which of you is the elder twin?" Salvain asked, her voice dry and clear. "I am," Caius said, stepping forward with the peculiar confidence he carried like a second skin. "By 4 minutes." Salvini's mouth twitched. She knelt slowly, bringing herself to his eye level. "Give me your hand." Caius looked at Vesna. She nodded, though everything in her was coiled tight. Caius placed his small hand in the elder's palm. Salven produced a thin silver needle and pricked his finger. A single drop of blood fell onto the black stone. The stone erupted. Not a glow, not the pale amber warmth Vesna had seen at the court demonstration years ago. The light that burst from the Hearthblood stone was blinding, a white-gold radiance so fierce it threw every shadow out of the room. The veins of silver in the stone blazed like molten metal, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. Salvene stumbled back. Hadric caught her arm. Vesna grabbed both boys and pulled them behind her on instinct. The light held for 3 heartbeats, then faded. The trembling stopped. The stone went dark again, but not fully. A faint pulse remained, beating inside the rock like a living heart. The room was utterly silent. She turned to Stellan with eyes that had gone wide and bright. "Now you," she said softly. "Your turn." Stellan looked up at Vesna with uncertainty. She knelt and smoothed his hair. "It's all right. It won't hurt." He stepped forward and held out his hand. The needle pricked. The blood fell. The stone answered differently this time. Where Caius's blood had produced blinding white gold, Stellan's blood sent a deep, resonant hum through the chamber that Vesna felt in her teeth, in her bones, in the soles of her feet. The silver veins in the stone didn't blaze. They sang, pulsing with a warm amber light that moved outward from the point of contact, like ripples in a pond, spreading along the floor, climbing the walls, filling the room with a vibration that sounded almost like a heartbeat. Then the two lights merged. The remnant of Caius's white gold blazed up from the stone to meet Stellan's amber warmth, and where they met, the stone pulsed with a brilliance that made every person in the room take a step backward. "Well," Solven murmured after a long moment, That hasn't happened in 400 years. What does it mean? Vesna demanded. Solvin straightened, her pale eyes fixed on the stone, with an expression that hovered between wonder and something much closer to fear. The standard confirmation produces an amber glow, faint for distant blood, stronger for direct descent. What we just witnessed is something else entirely. She paused. The last time the stone responded to two heirs with that intensity was during the founding era. When the first Alpha King and his Luna bonded the hearthline to the land, Vesna's blood went cold. These boys don't merely carry the Valdrin bloodline, Sullivan continued. They carry the hearthline itself. The bond between the throne and the land that has been weakening for years. She turned to face Vesna fully. It's been weakening because it was waiting for them. That's impossible, Vesna whispered. So is shifting at the age of 5, Sullivan replied. A sound came from behind them. The ironwood door had opened without anyone touching it, and standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the torchlit corridor, was a man Vesna had promised herself she would never feel anything for again. Tavern. He was thinner than she remembered. The broad shoulders were still there, but the flesh had pared away from his frame, leaving angles where there had once been solid weight. His dark hair was longer, pushed back from a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in a very long time. The shadows under his eyes were deep enough to bruise. He looked at her first, not at the boys, not at the stone. And the expression on his face nearly buckled her knees, because it wasn't anger or authority or the controlled composure she'd expected from the man who'd let her walk out of his life without a fight. It was grief, raw and staggering and deeper than years could measure. Vesna held his gaze. She did not let herself blink. Your sons are legitimate, she said, her voice perfectly steady. The stone confirmed it. Both of them. You have your heirs. Tavern's mouth opened. No sound came out. Mama, Stellan whispered from behind her legs. Is that him? The chambers they gave her were in the east wing, 3 rooms overlooking the palace gardens. The same gardens where she'd once grown lavender and chamomile alongside the royal herbalist. The same view she'd woken to every morning, for 3 years. She wondered if that was deliberate. If someone had chosen these particular rooms to remind her of what she lost, or if the palace simply had no space that didn't carry a memory sharp enough to cut. The boys didn't care about memories. They cared about the enormous bed, with more pillows than either of them had ever seen, and the fireplace large enough to stand in, and the window seat where they could kneel side by side and watch the courtyard below. Is this where you lived before? Caius asked, running his hand along the carved wooden bed frame. Near here, Vesna said carefully. Different rooms. Why did you leave? Vesna opened her mouth and closed it again. She'd known this question was coming. She'd prepared answers, gentle versions of the truth that a child could carry without being crushed by the weight. But standing in this palace, breathing air that smelled of old stone and cedar and him, every prepared answer dissolved. Sometimes people make mistakes, she said, and sometimes those mistakes mean you have to start over somewhere new. Caius considered this with the gravity of a much older child. Did our father make the mistake? Yes, Vesna said. He did. A knock interrupted them. Vesna opened the door expecting a servant, and found Tavern standing in the corridor. He'd changed clothes since the Hearthblood chamber. The formal coat was gone, replaced by a simple dark shirt with the sleeves pushed to his elbows. It made him look less like a king, and more like a man, and Vesna resented that intensely, because she didn't want to see him as a man. She wanted to see him as the throne that had discarded her. That was easier. May I? He stopped, cleared his throat, started again. May I meet them? The question came out rougher than she expected. Stripped of any royal authority, he wasn't commanding, he was asking. And the uncertainty in his voice was so foreign on him that it threw her off balance. Vesna stepped aside without a word. Tavern entered the room slowly, the way she'd seen people approach wounded animals. His gaze found the boys immediately. They were sitting together on the window seat, Caius with his legs folded beneath him, Stellan with his nose pressed against the glass. The king stopped in the middle of the room and looked at his sons for the first time, and Vesna watched something in his face break open like a fault line splitting stone. They had his eyes, his jaw. The same way of tilting their heads when something caught their attention, they were unmistakably, undeniably his, and every day of their existence, that he'd missed, hung in the air between them like a held breath. "Hello," Tavern said. Caius studied him with that uncanny directness. "You're the king." "Yes, and you're our father." Tavern swallowed visibly. "Yes, Mama said you made a mistake." The pause that followed was excruciating. Vesna briefly considered the possibility of the floor opening up and swallowing her whole. Tavern lowered himself until he was on one knee, bringing his face level with the boys. "Your mother is right," he said. "I made a very great mistake." "What kind?" Stellan asked, turning from the window with those wide amber-flecked eyes. "The kind you spend the rest of your life trying to fix," Tavern replied softly. Stellan tilted his head. Then he reached out and touched the king's face, his small hand pressing against Tavern's cheek, with a child's unself-conscious certainty. "You feel sad," Stellan announced, "like the ground on the way here." Tavern flinched. Not from the touch, but from whatever it was his son had just felt in him. The same gift that let the twins sense the dying land apparently extended to people. Caius hadn't moved from the window seat. He watched the exchange with his mother's guarded eyes, arms folded, jaw set. But Vesna noticed his gaze lingering on Tavern's face, studying it, comparing it, she realized, to his own reflection, to the features he'd seen in the mirror every day, without knowing where they came from. "We should go," Vesna said, her voice coming out tighter than she intended. "The boys need rest." Tavern stood. He looked at her, and for one terrible moment, she thought he was going to say something, something real, something that would make it harder to stay angry. Instead, he nodded. "Of course." He paused at the door. "If they need anything at all. I've managed since the day I left without your help," Vesna said. "I think we'll survive a few more nights." The words landed harder than she'd aimed them. She saw the impact register in his expression, a brief tightening around his eyes, a slight drop of his shoulders. Then the mask slid back into place, and he was the king again. "Good night, Vesna," he said softly. The door closed behind him. Vesna pressed her forehead against the wood and breathed through the ache that had settled behind her sternum, like a fist. She'd wanted that to feel like victory. It didn't. "Mama," Caius said from across the room. "He smells like you." Vesna closed her eyes. "No, he doesn't," she said. But he did. Beneath the cedar, and the iron and the exhaustion, there was a thread of something that her wolf recognized, with a pull so visceral it made her dizzy, the remnant of a bond that had been severed, but never fully died. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep in the enormous bed, Vesna walked to the window and looked down at the palace gardens. In the moonlight, she could see the flower beds. Everything in them was dead. Brown stalks, withered leaves, bare soil cracked with drought, except for one small patch near the east wall. Directly beneath the window, where Caius and Stellan had been sitting that afternoon, pressing their faces against the glass, a cluster of white flowers had bloomed in the dead garden, in the middle of autumn, in soil that hadn't produced anything living for over a year. Vesna stared at them for a very long time. The routine that formed over the following days was not one Vesna had agreed to. It simply happened the way weather happens gradually, and then all at once, and by the time she realized what was taking shape, it was already too late to stop it. Each morning, Elder Sullivan took the boys to the hearthblood chamber for what she called attunement exercises. Vesna didn't fully understand the process, but it involved the twins placing their hands on the ancestral stone and listening, or feeling, or whatever it was they did that made Salveni's eyebrows climb toward her hairline and her notes fill page after page. The boys treated it like a game. They competed over who could make the stone pulse brighter. Caius usually won, but Stellan had figured out how to make it hum, which Salvene said was unprecedented, and which Stellan found hilarious. Each afternoon, Vesna took them to the gardens. This was where the trouble started, because the gardens were where Tavern kept appearing. The first time could have been coincidence. He was walking through the courtyard with Hadric, discussing something that required maps and furrowed brows, and he happened to glance over as the boys chased each other through the dead flower beds. He'd stopped mid-sentence. Hadric had said something, and the king hadn't heard a word of it. The second time was less convincing. He was sitting on the stone bench near the eastern wall, alone, reading a document that he clearly wasn't reading because the pages hadn't turned in 10 minutes. The third time, he brought a wooden wolf. It was small and finely carved, with silver paint on its fur and tiny amber beads for eyes. He'd held it out to Caius without a word, and the boy had taken it, turned it over in his hands, and said, "The ears are wrong. Real wolf ears are more pointed." Vesna had watched Tavern absorb his criticism, with an expression of such earnest devastation that she'd had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. "I'll have it corrected," the king said solemnly. "I can show you," Caius offered. "I'll shift, and you can see." "Perhaps not in the garden," Vesna interrupted quickly, imagining the spectacle of a wolf pup tearing through the royal courtyard while the king took notes on ear anatomy. Tavern glanced at her. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not warmth, exactly, not yet, but the absence of hostility, which after so many years of anger felt dangerously close to the same thing. He came every day after that. Never presumed, he sat on his bench and watched the boys play. And when they spoke to him, he answered, with a patience Vesna had never seen in him before. The Tavern she'd known had been decisive, commanding, a man who moved through the world like it was supposed to bend around him. This version was different. This version waited, asked permission, accepted silence when it was offered. Stellan warmed to him first. The boy had always been the more open of the two, the one who trusted easily and gave affection without reservation. By the fourth day, Stellan was sitting beside the king on the bench, leaning against his arm, while Tavern pointed out birds in the courtyard and named them one by one. "That one's a thornfinch," Tavern said. "See the red on its breast?" "Mama knows birds too," Stellan offered. "She taught us all the ones near our house." A beat of silence. "She was always better with living things than I was," Tavern said, so softly it was almost to himself. He didn't look at Vesna, but she felt the words land somewhere deep inside her, like stones dropped into still water. Caius held out longer. He watched the king with his mother's careful eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. And he didn't sit on the bench. And he didn't lean against anyone. And when Tavern offered to show him the armory, Caius said, "Maybe tomorrow," in a tone that made it clear tomorrow meant never. But then the afternoon came, when Stellan fell. The boys had been running along the low garden wall, balancing on the stones the way they balanced on everything, fearless and fast. Stellan's foot slipped. He tumbled sideways, hit the flagstones, and yelped. Vesna was 20 feet away sorting herbs she'd gathered from the palace's neglected stillroom. She was already moving when she heard the cry, but Tavern was closer. He reached Stellan first, scooped the boy up with hands so gentle they might have been handling glass, and held him against his chest. Stellan clung to the king's shirt, sniffling, his face pressed into Tavern's shoulder. And Tavern just held him, one broad hand cradling the back of the boy's head, his eyes closed, his expression so nakedly tender that Vesna stopped in her tracks. He was murmuring something against Stellan's hair. She couldn't hear the words, but she could sense them through the frayed remnant of the bond that still connected them, a thread so thin she'd pretended it wasn't there. What reached her was a grief so layered it almost brought her to her knees. He was mourning, every skinned knee he hadn't been there for, every nightmare he'd never soothed, every bedtime story he'd never told. He was mourning them while holding his son for the first time, the way a father should, and the contradiction of having and having lost simultaneously was tearing him apart. "I'm fine," Stellan announced, pulling back with the resilience of the very young. "It doesn't even hurt anymore." Tavrin set him down carefully and brushed the dust from his knees. "You're very brave," he said, and his voice was almost steady. Vesna knelt to check Stellan's scrape. It was minor, nothing that needed treatment. But her hands lingered on her son's knee because she needed a moment before she could look at Tavrin. When she did, he was watching her. "Thank you," she said, 2 words. But they were the first she'd spoken to him without edge or armor since arriving at Greymark, and they both knew it. "Vesna," he said, and her name in his mouth after so long made something behind her sternum fracture. "I need to tell you something." "Don't," she said softly. "Not yet." He looked at her, searching. Then he nodded and stood and walked away without another word, and she was grateful and devastated in equal measure. That night, the boys woke her at the same time. They were sitting upright in bed, side by side, their eyes wide and gold-bright in the darkness. "We had the same dream," Caius whispered. Vesna's heartbeat spiked. "Tell me." "We were under the ground," Stellan said, "below the castle. And there were roots everywhere, big ones, glowing. But some of them were black, dead, and something was eating them." "Something was eating the roots?" Vesna repeated, keeping her voice calm, even as her insides dropped. Caius nodded. "It looked like a person, Mama. A woman. She was standing in the dark, and she was feeding the dead parts to the roots." The boys looked at each other, then back at her. "She knew we were watching," Stellan whispered. "She turned around and smiled at us." Vesna told Solvin about the twins' dream the following morning. The elder listened without interruption, her pale eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the chamber wall, her thin fingers steepled beneath her chin. When Vesna finished, the quiet that settled over the room lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. "A woman," Solvin repeated, "feeding darkness to the roots beneath the castle." That's what they described, both of them. The same dream, at the same time. Solvin rose from her chair and crossed to a shelf, lined with leather-bound volumes, so old their spines had cracked into illegibility. She pulled one free and laid it open on the table between them. "The hearthline isn't a metaphor," Solvin said, tracing a diagram with her finger. "It's a living system. Roots of power that run beneath the palace, beneath the kingdom itself, connecting the land to the throne through the bond of the ruling pair." "The ruling pair," Vesna echoed. "Meaning the king and his Luna." "Meaning both halves," Solvin confirmed. "The hearthline requires 2 anchors. The king's bond to the land is one half. The Luna's is the other." Vesna went still. Hadrick had explained the hearthline as an heir problem, a question of succession and bloodline continuity. But this was something different, something worse. "When you were cast aside," Solvin continued, "the Luna's anchor was ripped free. Half the hearthline has been untethered ever since." Vesna stared at her. "So, the crops, the rivers, the sickness spreading through the packs, all symptoms of an incomplete bond." Solvin closed the book. "The twins carry the hearthline potential because they are born of both anchors. Their presence has slowed the decay, but they cannot restore what was broken. The bond must be reforged by the original pair." The words settled over Vesna like a net, and she felt something inside her recoil. This wasn't what she had been told. Hadrick had made it sound like the twins were the solution, that bringing them to Greymark would be enough, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. "You're saying I would need to bond with him again," she said, her voice flat. "Willingly. I'm saying the kingdom will die without it." Vesna pushed back from the table and stood. Her chair scraped against the stone floor, with a sound that made her teeth ache. She walked to the narrow window and looked out at the palace grounds below, at the dead gardens and the dry fountain and the bare trees that hadn't dropped their leaves so much as surrendered them. That was the worst part. Ever since arriving at Greymark, the thread that connected her to Tavern had been thickening, strengthening, pulling taut like a rope being wound. She sensed his presence when he entered a room before she saw him. She caught his scent on corridors. She walked through, minutes after he'd passed. At night, her wolf pressed against the inside of her skin, restless and aching, reaching towards something she refused to name. The bond was rebuilding itself whether she consented or not. Her body remembered what her mind had spent all these years trying to forget. She'd caught him watching her yesterday, across the courtyard while the boys played. His eyes on her face, with an intensity that made the air between them feel like it was vibrating. She'd looked away first, her heart slamming against her ribs, her skin flushed, her hands trembling with something that wasn't anger, no matter how much she wanted it to be. And there were moments when the pull overwhelmed everything else. 2 nights ago, she'd turned a corner and walked straight into him. His hands had caught her arms to steady her, and the contact had sent a jolt through her entire body that made her gasp. They'd stood there for 3 heartbeats, his fingers on her skin, his scent flooding her senses, her wolf surging forward with a need so raw it frightened her. Then she'd pulled away and walked on without a word, and neither of them had mentioned it since. She wanted to hate him. She'd earned the right. He'd let her walk out of his life carrying his children, and he hadn't followed. But hate required distance, and distance was the one thing this place refused to give her. "There's something else," Salvain said, from behind her. "Something that troubles me more than the weakened hearthline." Vesna turned. The decay should have been gradual, a slow decline over years, even decades. "What I've observed in the land is far more aggressive than a severed bond should produce." She paused. "Your son's dream described a woman actively feeding darkness into the roots. If that's not merely symbolic, if someone has been deliberately poisoning the hearthline, then the kingdom isn't just dying," Vesna finished. "Someone is killing it." Sullivan met her gaze, and for the first time since they'd met, the elder looked old, not wise, not measured, old and afraid. "I sent for someone," Vesna said. "My mentor from Thornfeld. She's a healer. One of the best I've ever known. When does she arrive? Tomorrow?" That night, Vesna lay awake, listening to her sons breathe, and feeling the pull toward the west wing, where the king slept. It was physical now, a pressure beneath her ribs, an ache in her bones that deepened with every hour she spent within these walls. Her wolf whined softly inside her, and Vesna pressed her face into the pillow and whispered, "Not him." Not again, but the pull didn't care about what she wanted. Brindis arrived at Greymark with a leather bag full of dried herbs, a deeply suspicious expression and absolutely no patience for palace politics. "Show me everything," the old healer said before she'd even removed her traveling cloak. "Medical records, healer's logs, whatever this palace kept during your time here." Vesna had already requested the records from the palace archivist. It had taken Hadrick's authority to release them, but the stack of ledgers now sat on the table in Vesna's chambers. Years of court healer entries covering every tincture, every tonic, every treatment administered to the former Luna during her time as Tavern's mate. Brindis read for 3 hours without speaking. Vesna sat across from her, watching the old woman's expression shift from concentration to confusion, to something that looked increasingly like controlled fury. "What is it?" Vesna asked. Brindis held up a finger. "Read for another 20 minutes. Then closed the ledger, with a deliberateness that made the sound echo through the room. "You were never Barren," Brindis said. The words punched the air out of Vesna's lungs. "What? Silvervale root?" Brindis tapped the ledger. "It's listed here as a digestive supplement. The court healer administered it to you daily in your evening tea, throughout your 2nd and 3rd years at Greymark. Silvervale root is not a digestive supplement. In sustained low doses, it is the most effective fertility suppressant known to herbal medicine." The room tilted. Vesna gripped the edge of the table. "Someone was poisoning me," she said, and the words came out hollow and distant, like they belonged to someone else. "Systematically, deliberately, for at least 2 years. Brindis opened another ledger. "The dosing stopped when you were cast aside." The prescription disappears from the records entirely on the day you left Greymark, because I was no longer a problem to be solved. Brindis watched her carefully. Do you know who the court healer answered to? Vesna closed her eyes. She knew. She'd always known. In the way, you know something you refuse to look at directly. The court healer had been appointed by and reported to a single authority within the palace. Not the king, not the council, Lady Orlaith, Vesna said. The king's aunt, head of the household council. Brindis nodded slowly. The quiet that followed was vast and terrible. Vesna sat in it and felt the architecture of her last years rearranging itself. Every night she'd pressed her face into a pillow and wondered what was wrong with her body. Every prayer she'd whispered to whatever gods might listen, begging for a child. Every pitying glance, every whispered judgment. Every time someone had called her Barren and she'd swallowed the word like poison because she'd believed it. It had all been a lie, manufactured, administered in a teacup every evening by hands she trusted. The door opened. Tavern stood in the doorway. His gaze moved from Vesna's face to the ledgers spread across the table, and his expression shifted. He'd come for something else, some ordinary purpose, but whatever he saw in her eyes stopped him cold. What happened? He asked. Vesna couldn't speak. Brindis slid the ledger across the table and pointed. She watched Tavern read, watched the comprehension arrive, watched the color drain from his face in stages, like watching a tide pull back from a shore. His hands flattened against the table, his breathing changed, quickened, then stopped entirely. Silver Veil Root, he said, his voice barely audible. Your aunt's court healer prescribed it as a digestive aid, Brindis said. For 2 years. Tavern's fist hit the table so hard, the ledgers jumped. The sound was violent, sudden, cracking through the room like a breaking bone. Vesna flinched. She will answer for this, he said, and his voice was nothing she recognized. Low, guttural, vibrating with a rage that made the air in the room feel thin. I will see her stripped of everything she holds dear. You'll do nothing of the kind, Brindis said firmly. Not yet, but Vesna wasn't looking at Tavern's rage. She was looking past it, to what lay beneath. The horror, the guilt, the dawning realization of what he'd done. He'd cast aside his mate, based on a lie manufactured under his own roof by his own blood, and he'd never questioned it, never investigated, never asked why a healthy young woman couldn't conceive. He'd just accepted it, the way the council told him to. Vesna, he said, turning to her, and his voice cracked on her name. I didn't know. I swear to you, I never, you never, asked. Vesna said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of every year they'd been apart. You never questioned the diagnosis. You never demanded a second opinion. You never wondered whether something else might be wrong. You just believed them, and you let me go. I was trying to do what was right for the kingdom, Tavern said, and even as the words came out, she could see him, hearing how hollow they sounded. You were supposed to protect me. Vesna's voice broke. That was the bond. That was the promise. And instead, you handed me to the wolves, because it was easier than standing up to your own family. Tavern reached for her. She stepped back. Don't touch me, she said. Don't you dare touch me, right now. She gathered the boys from the adjoining room, her movements mechanical, her face carefully blank. Caius looked at her with those knowing eyes and said nothing. Stellan reached for her hand and held it tight. She locked the chamber door behind them, sat on the edge of the enormous bed, with a son on each side, and pressed her hands over her face. She did not cry. She was finished crying over what that palace had taken from her. The twins fell ill on the second morning after Brindis's discovery. Stellan woke first, burning with a fever so fierce his skin was almost too hot to touch. His eyes flickered between brown and gold in rapid, uncontrolled bursts, and his small body shook with tremors that Vesna recognized with sickening clarity. His wolf was trying to surface and being forced back down, over and over, like something was suppressing the shift. Caius followed within the hour. Same fever, same tremors, same terrible flickering in his eyes. Vesna's healer training took over. She stripped the bed, cooled their skin with damp cloths, checked their pulses and their breathing and the dilation of their pupils. The symptoms were textbook: accelerated heart rate, suppressed shift response, fever that climbed and climbed without breaking. She'd seen this before. In the medical ledgers Brindis had shown her. These were the early symptoms of Silvervale root exposure. Someone was poisoning her sons. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and for one terrible moment, her vision went white and her legs nearly buckled. Then the fury arrived, volcanic and absolute, and it burned the weakness away. She scanned the room, her healer's mind cataloging every source of contamination. The water pitcher on the nightstand, the plate of honeyed oat cakes that a palace servant had delivered the previous evening. The boys had eaten 2 each before bed. Vesna grabbed the plate and sniffed. Beneath the honey and the grain, so faint it was almost undetectable, she caught it. A bitter, resinous undertone that any trained herbalist would recognize. Silvervale root, ground into powder, folded into the batter, masked by sweetness. She tore open the chamber door. A guard stood outside, posted there since her arrival. "Get me Hadrick," she said. "Now. And don't let anyone into this room who isn't me or the old healer from Thornfeld. No servants, no food, no water from the palace stores. No one. Do you understand?" The guard took one look at her face and ran. Brindis arrived first, followed by Hadrick, followed by Tavern, who looked like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes went to the boys on the bed, and his face crumbled. He crossed to them in 2 strides and dropped to his knees beside the mattress, his hand hovering over Stellan's forehead, as though afraid his touch might make it worse. "Don't," Stellan mumbled through the fever, his small hand reaching up. "Don't go away again." Tavern's composure shattered. He took his son's hand and held it between both of his own, and the sound he made was not a word, just a low, broken exhalation that held more pain than any language could carry. "It's Silvervale," Vesna said, her voice clipped, "and professional, because if she let herself feel anything right now, she would come apart. The same compound used on me, administered through the food delivered to our chambers last night." She held up the plate. "But the dosing is more aggressive. Whoever is doing this isn't trying to suppress fertility. They're trying to sever the boy's connection to the hearth line." Solvin arrived minutes later. She took one look at the twins and pressed her palm to the hearth bloodstone fragment she wore on a chain around her neck. The small stone pulsed weakly, its light stuttering. "The hearth line is failing," the elder confirmed. "It's been accelerating since last night. Whatever is poisoning the boys is poisoning the bond itself." "How long do they have?" Tavern asked, his voice raw. Solvine hesitated, and that hesitation was worse than any answer. "Days," she said finally. "Perhaps less." Tavern turned to Hadrick. "Find my aunt. Find her now." Hadrick was already moving. "I've had her chambers watched since the ledger discovery. She left the palace last night through the eastern passage. My scouts are tracking her." "She's not running," Vesna said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. The boy's dream. The woman feeding darkness to the roots beneath the castle. Vesna's mind was racing now, connections forming faster than she could speak them. Orlaith isn't fleeing. She's finishing what she started. She's going to the source of the hearthline, to destroy it entirely. "The deep chamber," Solvin breathed, "beneath the hearthblood room, where the roots converge." "There's a chamber beneath?" Vesna asked. "Sealed for generations." "The original bonding site, where the first king and his Luna anchored the hearthline to the land." Solvin's face was ashen. "If she reaches it, if she poisons the roots at the source, the kingdom dies," Hadrick finished. "My sons die," Vesna corrected, and her voice carried a sharpness that made every person in the room take an involuntary step back. She turned to Brindis. "Can you stabilize them?" The old healer was already unpacking her bag, laying out dried herbs and tincture bottles with the practiced speed of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for the worst. I can slow the poison, buy time. But the only real cure is cutting off the source. Whatever Orlaith is feeding into the hearthline needs to stop. Vesna looked at Tavrin. Their eyes met across the bed where their sons lay shaking, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Greymark, there was no anger between them. No resentment, no armor, just two parents staring at the possibility of losing their children. Together, Tavrin said. It wasn't a command, it was a question. Vesna didn't hesitate. Together, she replied. They moved through the palace like a storm. Hadric flanked them with 4 guards. Solvin led them down corridors. Vesna had never walked through doors she hadn't known existed, deeper and deeper beneath the palace, until the stone walls turned rough and ancient, and the air grew cold and thick with the smell of wet earth. The entrance to the deep chamber was a hole in the rock face, half hidden behind a collapsed archway. Iron bars had once sealed it shut. They lay on the ground now, twisted aside with a strength that was more than human. Vesna sensed it before they entered. A wrongness in the air, a vibration that set her teeth on edge and made her wolf howl with distress. The hearthline was screaming, and no one above ground could hear it. She's in there, Vesna said. Tavrin drew his sword. Vesna pushed past him. This isn't a fight you win with a blade, she said over her shoulder. The hearthline is alive. It's connected to the land, to the throne, to our sons. You can't kill what's hurting it without understanding what it is. Then what do we do? Tavrin asked. Vesna stepped through the entrance and into the dark. We heal it. The deep chamber was vast. Vesna couldn't see its walls or its ceiling. The darkness stretched in every direction, broken only by a faint, sickly luminescence that rose from the ground itself. Roots, enormous roots, thick as old trees, woven through the stone floor and walls like veins through living flesh. They pulsed with a dim silver light that should have been beautiful but wasn't, because between the silver pulses, patches of black spread like bruises across the root system. Dead zones, rot, expanding slowly with every breath. And, standing at the center of it, her hands pressed flat against the largest root, was Lady Orlaith. She was older than Vesna remembered. Taller, thinner, sharper. Her silver hair fell loose around a face that might have been carved from the same stone as the chamber walls. She didn't turn when they entered. It took you longer than I expected, Orlaith said. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant, like she was commenting on the weather. Step away from the roots, Tavrin commanded, his voice echoing through the dark space. Orlaith laughed softly. Or what? You'll strike down your father's sister. The woman who raised you after your mother died? The woman who held this kingdom together while you were playing at being a husband to a commoner? The word landed like a slap. Vesna felt it, but it didn't sting the way it once would have. She'd been called worse. She'd called herself worse. You poisoned me, Vesna said, stepping forward. For 2 years you poisoned me to make me look barren. To make the council remove me. To preserve whatever you thought the bloodline should be. Orlaith finally turned. Her eyes moved over Vesna with the detached assessment of someone examining an insect. I did what was necessary, she said. A commoner on the throne poisons the line more surely than any herb. Your blood would have diluted generations of careful breeding. The hearthline was never meant for someone like you. And yet my sons carry it more strongly than any heir in 400 years, Vesna replied. Something flickered across Orlaith's face. Not doubt. Fury. The controlled, compressed fury of someone whose deepest conviction had been contradicted by reality. An aberration, Orlaith hissed. A mistake of nature that I am correcting. She pressed her hands harder against the root, and the black rot surged outward, spreading through the silver veins with a speed that made Vesna's insides lurch. Above them, distantly, she imagined she could hear the kingdom groaning. Trees falling, rivers draining, animals collapsing. And in a chamber far above, Two small boys burning with fever, Tavern, Vesna said, not looking away from Orlaith. The hearth line needs both anchors, both halves King and Luna. That's what Salvin shed. She felt him move closer, felt the heat of him at her back. Vesna, I need to say something, Tavern said, his voice rough and low, before whatever happens next. Now isn't the time for. It is exactly the time, he interrupted, because I may not get another chance, and I've already wasted years of chances. He paused. She could hear him breathing, unsteady for the first time. I was a coward. I told myself I was choosing duty, choosing the kingdom, but I was choosing the path that didn't require me to stand alone. The council said you were barren, and I believed them, because believing them was easier than fighting everyone I'd been raised to trust. He moved until he was beside her. She could see his profile in the sickly light, the hard line of his jaw, the tension in his throat. I should have fought for you. I should have burned the council chambers to the ground before I let them take you from me. And every single day since, I have carried the knowledge that I failed. The only person who ever mattered more than the throne. Vesna's vision blurred. She blinked hard. You let me believe I was broken, she whispered. I know. I raised your sons alone, and every night I wondered what was wrong with me, why I wasn't enough, why my body couldn't do the one thing everyone expected of me. Her voice cracked. Do you understand what it does to a person? To carry a lie that heavy for that long, it becomes part of you. It grows into your bones. I built my entire life around the belief that I was less than what I should have been. Tavern's hand found hers in the dark. His fingers were trembling. You were never broken, he said, and his voice shattered on the word. You were never less. You were the strongest, bravest, most extraordinary person I have ever known, and I threw you away because I was too weak to deserve you. Vesna gripped his hand so hard, her knuckles went white. Behind them, Orlaith laughed again. How touching. The commoner and the king, reconciling over sentiment while the kingdom crumbles. You can't restore what I've destroyed. The rot is too deep. Vesna turned to face the root system. The black patches were spreading faster now, consuming the silver light. The chamber was growing darker, colder. She looked at the roots, at the dying light, at the rot that was eating the kingdom from below, and she thought about her sons. About Caius's stubbornness and Stellan's gentleness, and the way they'd made flowers bloom in a dead garden just by sitting near a window. She thought about what Salvin had said. Both halves. King and Luna. I wasn't broken then, Vesna said. And I'm not broken now, she looked at Tavern. Not for the kingdom, not for the throne, not even for you. I'm choosing this for myself. Because I spent years believing a lie. And I am finished letting someone else's poison define who I am. She placed her hand on the nearest root. It was warm beneath her palm, alive despite the rot, fighting to survive, the way everything fights to survive when it still has something worth reaching toward. Tavern, she said, take my hand. He did. The moment their hands joined on the root, the world split open, light erupted from the point of contact. Not the sickly silver that had been guttering through the chamber, but something brighter, warmer. Gold, shot through with threads of white and green, pouring into the root system like water flooding a dry riverbed. Vesna gasped. She could feel it. The hearthline alive beneath her fingers, responding to the dual bond of King and Luna for the first time since she'd been cast aside. It surged through the roots with desperate hunger, racing outward, pushing against the black rot, burning it back inch by inch. But it wasn't enough. Orlaith's poison had been feeding for years. The rot was deep, entrenched, woven into the root system like a parasite that had made itself at home. The golden light advanced, and the darkness retreated, but slowly, too slowly, and Vesna could feel the strain. Like trying to fill a lake with a cup. More, she breathed. It needs more. Orlaith pressed both hands against the central root and pushed. The black rot surged back with renewed force, and Vesna felt the hearthline shudder beneath her palm. She stumbled. Tavern caught her, his arm around her waist, his other hand still flat on the root. You can't win, Orlaith said through gritted teeth. I have been feeding this rot since the day she left. Years of poison against one moment of sentiment. The math doesn't favor you. And for a terrible moment, Vesna believed her. The golden light was dimming. The rot was advancing again, creeping toward their hands like dark water rising. She could feel her strength draining, could feel the hearthline weakening beneath the assault. Then she heard it. Small footsteps, running, the sound echoing through the stone corridors above, growing louder, closer. No, Vesna whispered. No, they can't be here. They're sick. They should be in bed. But the boys appeared at the chamber entrance, both of them barefoot, both of them flushed with fever, their eyes blazing gold in the darkness. Brindis appeared behind them, out of breath and wild-eyed. I couldn't stop them, the old healer gasped. They woke up and ran, said they could hear something calling them. The roots, Stellan said, his small voice echoing in the vast chamber. They're crying, Mama. Can you hear them crying? Caius didn't speak. He walked forward with steady, deliberate steps, his brother following. And Vesna reached for them, but Tavern held her back. Wait, he said. They're sick. They shouldn't. Look, Tavern said. Where the boys walked, the roots beneath their bare feet brightened. The rot peeled back from their footsteps like shadow retreating from candlelight. With every step they took, the silver veins around them pulsed stronger, steadier, responding to their presence, the way a fire responds to kindling. The boys reached the nearest root and knelt. They placed their palms against it simultaneously, and the chamber exploded with light, not gold, this time white. Pure, blazing, absolute white that flooded every corner of the chamber and burned the shadows out of existence. The roots beneath their hands blazed like molten silver, and the pulse that erupted from the point of contact sent a shock wave through the entire system. Vesna felt it in her bones, in the marrow of her being. The hearthline wasn't just responding to the twins, it was recognizing them, welcoming them, embracing them the way the land embraces rain after a drought. The rot burned, it didn't retreat, it didn't fade, it burned. Black became gray, became white, became nothing, consumed by the light that poured from two boys who knelt on a stone floor with their palms on roots older than the kingdom itself. Orlaith screamed. The central root beneath her hands rejected her, and she was thrown backward, skidding across the stone floor. She scrambled to her feet, her face twisted with something beyond fury. Aberrations, she spat. Mongrel blood. The line was pure for generations before she tainted it. Caius looked up at her. His eyes were fully gold now, steady and ancient in his young face. The line was dying, he said, and his voice carried a weight that didn't belong to a child. We are what it needed to live. The last of the rot crumbled. The roots blazed with renewed silver light, pulsing in rhythm, strong and steady. The ground beneath their feet trembled, not with destruction, but with growth. Vesna could feel it spreading outward and upward, through the bedrock, through the foundations, into the soil above, reaching toward the surface like 1,000 buried things, finally breaking free. Orlaith lunged, not toward the roots, toward the boys. Tavern moved faster than Vesna had ever seen anyone move. He caught his aunt by the arm and spun her against the chamber wall, his body between her and his son's. His wolf was at the surface, his eyes blazing, his voice barely human. You poisoned my mate? You tried to kill my sons. You nearly destroyed this kingdom. He leaned close. Give me one reason. Orlaith stared at him, and even now, even pinned against the wall by a wolf, on the edge of shifting, her expression held nothing. I did it for the bloodline, she said. Everything I did was to protect what our family built. Our family built a kingdom meant to shelter all its people, Tavern replied. Not to poison the ones you deemed unworthy. He released her. She dropped to the ground, Hadrick and the guards were already there, iron shackles in hand. As they led her away, Orlaith looked back once. Not at Tavern, at Vesna. "You'll never truly belong here," she said. "I already do," she replied. The chamber fell quiet. The roots pulsed with silver light. The air smelled of clean earth and growing things. Stellan tugged at Vesna's sleeve, his fever already fading, his eyes softening back to brown. "Mama," he said. The roots stopped crying. Vesna knelt and gathered both boys against her chest, holding them so tight she could feel their heartbeats against her own. Tavern dropped to his knees beside them, his arms wrapping around all three, his forehead pressed against the back of her neck. For a long moment, in the warm silver light of a hearthline reborn, the four of them stayed exactly like that. The hearthline didn't heal the kingdom overnight, but it healed. The first sign came within days. The river in the eastern province rose 3 inches. The palace wells, which had been drawing low and bitter for over a year, ran clean and sweet. A farmer on the southern border sent word that his barren fields had sprouted green overnight, tiny shoots pushing through cracked earth, like fingers reaching for the sun. Within a month, the outer packs reported that the wasting sickness had stopped spreading. Wolves who'd been too weak to shift were shifting again. The land, so long starved of the bond it needed, was drinking in the restored hearthline, like parched soil drinking rain. Orlaith stood trial before the council. She offered no defense. She was stripped of her title, her lands, and her place within the court. Vesna didn't attend the sentencing. She had more important things to do, like watching her sons grow. The twins' wolf abilities stabilized over the following weeks. They still shifted younger than any recorded wolf in Valdren history, but the fevers and the uncontrolled transformations faded. Solveni continued their attunement training, and the Hearthblade stone responded to them with a warmth and steadiness that made the elders smile in a way Vesna suspected she hadn't smiled in a very long time. Tavrin courted her. There was no other word for it. He did it badly at first, with too much formality and not enough honesty, bringing gifts she didn't need and making speeches she didn't want. Vesna told him to stop. "Just be here," she said. "That's all I ever wanted," he learned. Slowly, imperfectly, the way all real things are learned. He showed up in the garden, with dirt on his hands, and helped her plant the lavender. He sat with the boys at breakfast and let Caius correct his understanding of wolfier anatomy. He told Vesna the truth, even when it was ugly, and he listened when she did the same. The bond between them didn't snap into place the way it had in the deep chamber. It grew. Day by day, conversation by conversation, touch by touch, until one morning Vesna woke with Tavern's arm around her waist and realized the ache she'd been carrying was gone. Not filled, healed. The scar was still there. It would always be there. But it had closed, finally, after all those years. Spring came early that year. The Thornfeld market, so far from the capital that most maps still didn't name it, was overflowing. Carts of winter vegetables and early wildflowers lined the cobblestones. The bread stall had expanded. The merchant with the clay pots had rebuilt his tower, taller this time. 2 small boys tore through the square, laughing, their dark hair wild, their boots muddy, their coats already missing buttons. They were 5, nearly 6, and they looked like ordinary children, and they were anything but. Vesna watched them from the edge of the square, her arms crossed, her mouth curved, in a smile she couldn't have suppressed if she'd tried. Tavern stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. His hand found hers and their fingers laced together, easy and unhurried, like they had all the time in the world. "They're going to knock over that pot stall again," Tavern observed. "Probably," Vesna agreed. A crash, a merchant's shout. 2 boys running in opposite directions, grinning. Vesna laughed, and the sound carried across the square like the first warm wind of a season that had almost never come.